additions, amendments, and changes, right? So if I were to re-ask that question, we might come up with a very different answer. We might say, well, yeah, on the outside, at the outset, this was very much by the hand of Thomas Jefferson, but there's a much more complex story involved in the processing and construction of this document. Now again, very crude example, but hopefully it's going to illustrate something more broadly that I'd like to talk about here today. And that is the constructed nature of text, or texts. And in particular, a letter collection. So as I was completing my first book project, I had a friend who had suggested I visit Raleigh, North Carolina. And he said, there you'll find the letters of two brothers, John and Charlie Futch, members of the 3rd North Carolina Infantry. And so it's an astounding collection. You're going to be quite surprised by what you see. Now, Civil War historians are generally not surprised by what we see, right? We, unlike some of my colleagues in the history department, have literally tens of thousands of sources that are immediately at our fingertips, right? Some of them are printed primaries, some of them are available online, some are archival documents. We know generally what we're going to find. And I will say, though, in this instance, this is one of the most remarkable letter collections I have ever seen in my career. And it actually was arranged kind of incorrectly, not the archivist's fault, it's probably some patron's fault, probably my friend's fault actually, who told me to go there. And so it actually starts at the end of the collection and moves back in time, which makes the story all the more compelling. I'm actually going to start the story at a particular moment and kind of wind back and give you broader context before we move forward. But I'll say at the outset that these documents carry a tremendous amount of historical weight and value. Now, because my audience here varies a great deal, I'm going to stop a lot. I'm going to talk about historical context, because without doing so, I think the story will be rather confusing. Okay? So everyone's with me thus far. So let me start here, at this hill, which is located in a small town in south central Pennsylvania, Gettysburg. In June of 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee invaded Pennsylvania with his army of Northern Virginia. Ultimately, he intended to 1, relieve the Shenandoah Valley, 2, threaten major northern population centers, 3, offer a decisive battlefield victory that would weaken, he hoped, northern morale. The war had been going on now for over 2 years without any sort of clear resolution. And so Lee launches his grand northern invasion with extremely high hopes. But ultimately, it's a gamble. Now, on July the 1st of this great 3-day battle, things seemingly go incredibly well for the Confederate forces. By nightfall, they had achieved a monumental victory. They had pushed back 2 Union corps, destroyed them in some instances, the 11th Corps in particular. But they were never able to gain some significant terrain to the south and east of town. Now, you don't need to be a military historian or a military buff to know the high ground gives you a decisive advantage on a battlefield. And 2 of these high positions are of particular importance to our narrative. One was known as Cemetery Hill, and the second, pictured here, was known as Colts Hill. These ultimately anchored the far right flank of the Union Army of the Potomac. It's July 2nd now, the second day of the battle. The skies darkened with the onset of twilight. The fate of General Robert E. Lee's grand northern invasion ultimately now hung in the balance. He had been repulsed all throughout the late afternoon on his assaults on the Union left flank. And everything now hinged upon the assault on the Union right, here at this area, Culp's Hill, this high, prominent position, located to the south and east of town. Confederate General Richard S. Ewell launched his attack, as I said, as the skies darkened. One division, composed of some 4,700 Confederate men, were going to throw themselves against about 1,600 New Yorkers who were firmly entrenched on Culp's Hill. The ground itself was extremely difficult. According to one commander, he said, quote, "I then advanced my infantry to the assault of the enemy's strong position, a rugged and rocky mountain, heavily timbered and difficult of ascent, a natural fortification." And again, this wartime picture, I think, captures this so clearly. And again, put yourself in that moment. You're not only dealing now with darkened skies, but the confusion of the battle itself, right? This is the period before smokeless black powder. So the powder now is hanging around the nooks and crannies, hanging through the woods. Thunderous booms are going off from the cannonade that's being thrown into this hillside. It's a terrifying proposition. It's a terrifying position. It's a terrifying position in particular for two young men, John and Charlie Futch, the men of whom I just spoke, members of this Confederate assaulting force. The men of the 3rd, before they move into Culp's Hill, are under heavy artillery fire. Once they start moving forward, they then come under small arms fire. Heavy lead balls being thrown at them at high velocities, picking off men in large numbers. Nonetheless, the men stream on, move forward, surge up to the perimeter of Culp's Hill, and there the fortunate begin to position themselves behind rocky crevices and high rocks and fat trees. But such was not the case for John and Charlie Futch. These men are lying down exposed on the hilltop. An unrelenting fire pouring down upon their heads. Charlie is lying prone, has his musket, is trying to load it. And at that minute, a lead ball pierces his head. It renders him unable to speak. His brother notes that he seems anxious, as though he wants to say something, as though he wants to communicate something to his beloved brother John, but ultimately he's unable. His condition worsens, and by the next day, July the 3rd, 1863, John Futch is going to bury his brother Charlie in Pennsylvania soil. Also on July 3rd, 1863, Lee launches his final fateful assault, known forever as Pickett's Charge. On the 4th of July, ironically, he is turned back. Now, the military service record of John and Charlie Futch is not terribly unusual. 3 out of every 5 white Southern men of military age, between the ages of 18 and 35, ultimately served the Confederacy in some capacity. Out of that group, depending upon your historian, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 are killed or wounded over the course of the conflict. So Charlie represents, abstractly, a number and nothing more. But what I will tell you here today is that they are quite unusual because of the material record that they left behind, because of the archive collection that they gave to posterity. There's got to be some questions throughout the day here that I'm going to try to kind of figure out with you, perhaps, and make you some insights. I'll say this, the research is largely new. I put a little bit of this in my last book, but most of this is going to actually entail an entire book project. So a lot of these questions I can't fully resolve, so I'll beg your pardon. But I'm going to say that I think John Futch was possibly semi-literate. And we'll talk about the significance of that here in a minute. But I think John Futch was possibly semi-literate. What we do know is that many of the letters in the John Futch collection were definitely written by other people. And their education, in turn, varied a great deal. All of these wartime letters from 1860 to 1863 were directed to his beloved wife, Martha. Very early in the war, when John was still in North Carolina and Charlie was at the front, John and Charlie corresponded, though that too is filled with ambiguities I'll have to decipher here today. Now I'm a scholar of emotions history. I'm interested in how people feel, and more importantly, how they express those feelings. Because feelings themselves are actually historical products that change over time. The way in which we express anger, for instance, as the people in the 1500s looks entirely different than the way in which we express it in the 1900s, which looks different than how we express it here today. And so emotions are rooted in historical context. And the historical context that I want to talk about here today is very specific in the society about which we will speak. Victorians had very specific notions in regards to death and dying. And that's going to be of paramount importance as we go through our narrative here. Generally, written descriptions portrayed closed emotions. People weren't, well, they could have been privately weeping while they're writing the letters, but the letters themselves